Peace. This is Time Map Part 2, and we're going to dive into the history of calendars. I'm Janan Derso, walking us through time. First, I want to start with tortoise time. When we examine life on Earth from a scientific level before humans, there were ancient animals. I love the stories and the biological reminders of the tales of whales, of the tales of tortoises. Right? These tortoises are over 220 million years old. Their back illustrates time as the 13 big markings and 28 small ones around the rim of their shell. And you can count them on any turtle or tortoise. It is always uniform. So I love this meaning of esoteric here because it aligns us that the truth can be right in front of our eyes, right in plain sight. And so to me, this is one of the first calendars as it illustrates this 13 moon cycle in a year, this 28-day cycle in a month. And without needing all of these other technological tools, we have this illustration. It's also a natural state of health for women when they're in their menses cycles. And so it shows us the profound health we can all really come into with a 28-day cycle. This moon rhythm, this record of time that we're going to keep looking through is the lens of Africa next. And so a long time ago, there was this calendar known as Adam's calendar, which I'm sure is a more modern name for it, but it is 300,000 years before the Common Era. That is the initial way that people spoke of time. It might not have even been a number calendar, but a way for people to create this concept of a linear time reality when we aren't even in one. And most of these ancient cultures were connected to prayer, and through their daily rhythm with nature, they didn't necessarily need to write things down. So I keep digging and I find there's land monuments in Scotland that go back 8,000 years ago that may be a representation of lunar calendars. Many cultures use stones to reveal cross sections of seasons. Tons of documentaries on these facts. 5,000 years ago, there's Egyptian calendars that are known to have used a 360-day year calendar, honoring 3 seasons, each 4 months long, beginning with the space for an extra 5 days for feasts and celebrations. So that would be the extra 365 edition here, based on the star of Sirius. And this story, if you've gone into it, is pretty elaborate and used as this observation for the Nile River's timings to place their seasons of when the water would flood, right? And all of their plants would grow. So specifically, this timing on the calendar, the current calendar would be 2976 BCE. Africa definitely had these high-level systems for tracking time. People have seen even current documentation of what's below the pyramids. I mean, on and on here, right? There's a remembrance of knowledge, and much of this was burned down in the fires of the libraries of Alexandria and Egypt in 48 BCE by Caesar during the Roman calendar era. So if you want your calendar to be the primordial calendar, then you'd probably like to burn down the other ones, right? A lot of us have heard of the expert Maya timekeepers, right? You can go down there, as I have, to study and look at the way that they keep time. I find theirs to be extremely complex. Most people do, because not only do they date back to specifically August 11th, 3114 BCE, but they have 2 calendars. And so there was a period that ended in 2012 of December. A lot of people who are alive remember this date, December 21st, 2012. That ended a 5,125 year cycle. And so it wasn't the end of time, but it was the end of that cycle. And so they have this long form representation of the 365-day cycle of the sun. There's 18 months, 20 days each. And this was primarily an agricultural calendar. They had an extra 5 days, which were considered unlucky in their calendar. A lot of the faiths I've seen with these extra 5 days is a time for purification. And so maybe this is also a mistranslation. I don't really know, but that was the word that I found associated with it. But the other cultures that I know use this as, purification of your perhaps karma, of your deeds, of what it is that you've dealt with in this past year. So we set this time aside. The other calendar had 260 days, which is 20 cycles of 13 if you do the math. And so they are clearly tracking both the sun and the moon. They've got this complex measurement because they are tracking two systems simultaneously, which I'm a big advocate of. We need to track two systems simultaneously. So a couple other brief things I'm just going to add. Clearly, like the Chinese and the Tibetan, they had solar and lunar cycles for thousands of years, right? There's a credited first accurate Chinese calendar from 2697 BCE, and they are on within their calendar as we propose it into the Gregorian year. There's a difference. So I added this date here, but honestly, we're going to find so many discrepancies that the numbers aren't even that important. Really, what I'm striking up here is this conversation of how many people have used different calendars, right? The Nepali people used a lunar calendar that is also ahead of the Gregorian one. Lunar counting will do that. The Hindu astronomy calendar, that was finalized at the turn of the era and began potentially much earlier. So that's at 6,676 BCE. The Vikrami calendar began at 57 BCE. The Persian calendar is over 2,000 years old in present-day Iran. It has a lunar and solar 12-month, 30-day each rhythm that was designed to begin on vernal equinox in 1074 AD, 4 seasons, first 6 months having 31 days, and then 5 months having 30 days, and the last month having 29 or 30 on the leap year. Many cultures, right, like the Hawaiian, the Maori, they have used the lunar calendar throughout their histories. Then there's this thing called sun time, right? And this heliocentric viewpoint with counting time in relationship to space as a method of making sense of life, the world, and one's place in it. And I get it because this is what I'm here doing. This is how people really began to move into a straightforward way to count time. And it was with sundials because they're positioned to the sun in the sense of balanced days and nights with sunsets and sunrises happened naturally at the equator. And so high noon counted time, and then 1 hour after high noon, because you could see the sun's shadow, became this logical sense of 1 o'clock, right? And that 6 p.m., that was sunset. There's 6 hours. Then they could count backward from high noon for the previous 6 hours. This sundial really moved people into this solar distinction. And because people didn't have electricity and they didn't work around the clock and night shifts and all these things, this worked, right? They went to sleep, they rose before the sun to get the most of each day. I think that we can learn a lot from this system. But now we have electricity, people aren't using sundials, they're working at night. Yes, this is true. So Ethiopian time is another way they count time in daylight. They didn't have electricity until more recently. They were never colonized. And so external information was very limited and less relevant to their intact culture. And what's really cool about their way that they track time is that high noon is not the reference point. Okay. The distinction here is 1 o'clock is 1 hour after sunrise. And so, because they worked in the field as an agrarian culture in the past, they used this as their rhythm for what was to be named time. Their solstices weren't as pronounced. Their longest day may be 13 hours because they were closer to the equator. And it's a minimal difference between these 4 gateways of time of spring equinox to winter solstice. And so I tracked those sunrise times just for us to really see why for them this was almost, non-differential. So using this kind of a system of 1 hour after sunrise was accurate enough. It's just a few minutes different. Ethiopia also has a 13-month calendar. And so the way that they track time is 12 months of 30 days. And then the 5 extra days or 6 on the leap year is this 13th month. And it's called the Pugme. And again, this is a time for purification. It's for preparation for their new year, which in the Gregorian calendar translates to September 11th. So I use this in my sun map calendar because I find that the 13th month is so revitalizing for taking time for purification. The other difference in their calendar is there's a 7.5 year discrepancy between theirs and the current Gregorian calendar. So they've, like in 2023, they had just started 2016. So that's the 7 year difference because it's January and then September is their first month, Meskorem, on September 11th. So they're calculating the birth of Jesus to be 7 years before Western Christianity, right? So his birth was honored on January 7th, 7 years prior, because in their calendar, he's born 5,500 years after Adam. Remember, I was referring to the Adam calendar. The Coptic calendar is very similar to the one of Alexandria and the previous capital of Egypt. Their time is based on this Coptic Christian origin story. Another interesting piece of this story is what happened in the sky on 7 BC, or this would be 0 in Ethiopia. The scientist who most of us know, Johannes Kepler, he observed Saturn and Jupiter in the Whales group, that would be Cetus, becoming very close together and appear as one star. And so this really brought forth a whole different way of understanding this star that they were potentially following, was two conjunct planets, Saturn and Jupiter, in Cetus. And so this really allowed a whole new birth of a one love, a unity template to have an origin time. So here's my source notation if you want to check it out. I find it a very fascinating alignment. So is this the key though, right? For me, I found it interesting. You may not find it as interesting, but like, is this bright star that Mary followed, this significant navigation device, part of the calendar's history? All this to say question time, right? Ask who started the whole belief system that was crafted. And how does this affect you, right? Your day-to-day workflow. What do you believe in? The modern calendar is based on the birth of Jesus, which may have been 7 years earlier than the Roman Catholic Church calculates. You don't need to spend too much time here. I'm not trying to create judgment. I'm merely entering these as facts into the curriculum of the time map because I implore you to let go of your previous notions around time, right? And really, moreover, from the desire to restore connection to nature and to divinity, into oneness consciousness, how do we really rebuild our time connection based on love instead of fear? All right, we're going to take a breath and move into the European heliocentric viewpoint, right? This is a very big viewpoint in the world, a wide influence on how we perceive time today and how we see the solar system. So we've got our notable cast. I'm just going to list them off. We've got Socrates. He clearly studied in Africa and brought knowledge of time back to his people. He taught Plato, who then taught Greek Aristotle, who then went on to tutor Alexander the Great. And then we have Ptolemy, who is very influenced by Aristotle, especially in regards to the solar system. These were geocentric thinkers where Earth was at the center of the solar system, right? And so that's a very big influence here. Once they figured out that Earth wasn't, it was really Copernicus who's given credit for establishing the heliocentric viewpoint in a wider level. And although it wasn't totally accurate, Johannes Kepler then built, he's credited with him and Galileo, these devices that could help us understand things, right? So they introduced the elliptical orbits to explain how the solar system moved. And then this functioning telescope comes through in 1609 to see the cosmic occurrences. They had to see it to know it. And then we get to move on through what's taught in schools and blah, blah, blah. Honestly, to me, there's cultural perceptions you can consider. There's going to be myths. We're going to have to really disassociate, in my opinion, from some of this Greek and Roman lore because it's what makes tropical astrology and sets the tone for that. And I talk about this in a whole next chapter and a whole next session, but we have to remember when we look at mainstream astrology, how heavily it was influenced by the narrative of the Greek and Roman stories that are based on war and conquering. Like, none of this is seated in love. It's just not. And so if we want to really reclaim time and come into a new connection, this is the point of entry. And this is why I talk about this, because we can look at the stars accurately. We can look up at them through astronomy now and see where they are. And we don't have to rely on somebody else to tell us the cosmic view of the universe, right? Okay, back to calendars. So modern wise, we kind of see there's the Roman, the Julian, and the Gregorian, right? The Roman calendar, 304 BC, it was proved to not be accurate or complete enough. So then it got replaced by the Julian calendar. Same thing happens. The start date of Easter is paramount to these different churches. And so the Julian calendar was now off because of precession, but they haven't figured this out yet. And so this was disturbing the Catholic Church. And Easter is celebrated on the first Sunday after the first Monday, after the first full moon after spring equinox. And so the Orthodox, they calculate it in the same way, but it's based on the Julian calendar. And so again, this is just interesting. This so much of what our time is running on now in these calendars is based on this birth of Jesus, but we don't even know if that's accurate, right? Depending upon the culture that you live in. Okay. So now we've got our Gregorian calendar. The start date is so sketchy, right? It's only 441 years old, but it's based on this. The father of this calendar is Pope Gregory the 13th. He puts this into effect on October 1582, but it took time for countries to adopt it, and 11 days vanish to recalculate for the Julian calendar, which is funny, right? So it has what we're modernly used, this 365 days with a leap year every fourth year to add a day. Benjamin Franklin, he came later, right? But he looked back and he shared about the adoption of the Gregorian calendar. It is pleasant for an old man to be able to go to bed on September 2nd and not have to get up until September 14th, because this is that window of time. There's that 11 days it took for people to get on board, give or take a day. But this vanishing to me is such interesting timing, because this is exactly when in the Ethiopian calendar is the 13th month and their New Year. So this is the time for purification, for ritual, and for peace. That's what they took out, y'all. And this is important to me because ever since then, the adoption of this calendar, and yes, the Roman and Julian also had, like I said, the war and the seeding of fear. But this is when Europe really took hold, and this entire global approach about using time for fiscal commerce needs became extremely prevalent. Later, even countries like China, Russia, and Ethiopia did join. They don't use it for religious purposes, but this is the window. This is what we're looking at. And so just to bring this part into a close, because I don't want to have to stay here long, the goal of the Gregorian calendar aided the movement for people to stop being agriculturally minded. It pushed forward the movement for factories to feed capitalism and the concept of ownership. Ownership, they to have, to hold, to keep. The 9 to 5 factory jobs were the way to get farmers off their land and work at scale. And it's part of a bigger story around war and land and certain egos that put the system into motion to further our separation from God and from nature and from each other, and clearly from love. So, because the Gregorian calendar has entrenched humanity in a time wheel, we've collectively been brought into a story of myth in order to cope with the suffering of being tied to their rules and laws of taxation. This example is found all over history, with conquering lands, stealing people and property, and corruption for the name of religion, for the purpose of power, money, and influence. Illusion from the separateness of God reaches far beyond this recent history. I'll come back to this topic in the next time map session, but I do find it's it's easier or it's pertinent to examine the recent history in order to move the mind into a place of curiosity and questioning reality, right? What are we doing? We are shedding this illusion of time to step into timelessness with prayer, to move beyond the concepts of taxes, war, corruption, evil, and wrong-mindedness, right? We're going to remind us of the opposite: unity, love, gratitude, peace, and the path of God. So to shed time and distractions, we get to steep in God's love, which ripples out to humanity again. So I pause here to invite in love with our breath. Before we move into the next video, Time Map Part 3, it's all about how to reclaim time. Please join me there. Peace.